We already transferred the shop to a development group, Marcus told me, pouring himself a glass of bourbon like he was announcing a grocery run. Your grandfather wanted the family to have liquidity. You'll understand when you're older. I was 29 years old, sitting in the living room of the house I'd helped my grandfather paint every summer until I was 16. And my uncle had just told me that the machine shop my grandfather left me, the one he'd built from a single lathe and 30 years of grease under his fingernails, was gone. Sold. Done. Before the man had even been in the ground for 3 weeks. I set my coffee mug down on the side table very carefully, because if I didn't do something careful with my hands right then, I wasn't sure what I'd do with them. My grandfather, Harold Beckett, had spent 41 years building Beckett precision parts in the industrial district of Denver. He'd machined components for aerospace contractors, built a reputation for tolerance work so fine that clients flew in from the coasts just to shake his hand. When he updated his will 2 years before his death, he was specific in a way that surprised even his estate attorney. The shop, the building it sat in, the equipment, the client contracts, and the business accounts, all of it was to pass to me, Rachel Beckett, his eldest grandchild, through a revocable trust he'd established in my name. He'd told me about it himself, sitting on the back porch with a glass of sweet tea while the sun went down over the Rockies. You're the only one in this family who understands what it means to build something, he'd said. Don't let Marcus talk you into selling it. I'd laughed a little and told him he was being dramatic. That was 16 months before he died. My uncle Marcus was my grandfather's son from his second marriage, 17 years younger than my father, who had passed away when I was 11. Marcus had the kind of easy confidence that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. He'd spent most of his adult life, adjacent to real work, dabbling in real estate development, sitting on the advisory boards of companies that paid him to show up at quarterly lunches, living on the interest from a trust of his own that my grandfather had funded out of guilt for an absent childhood. He wore good shoes and had an opinion on everything, and he'd never once touched a machine in that shop without calling it quaint. His wife, my Aunt Diane, sat across from me now, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing an expression that I can only describe as compassionate condescension. Your grandfather loved you very much, Rachel, she said. But the shop was a liability. The equipment was aging. The lease on the building was up for renegotiation. Marcus made a very difficult decision, but it was the right one for the family. The trust was in my name, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. He was required to distribute assets to me, not liquidate them. Marcus swirled his bourbon. The trust had a discretionary management clause. As co-trustee, I had the legal authority to determine that liquidation served your long-term financial interests better than an illiquid business asset. The proceeds are being held in the trust account. You'll receive a distribution once everything clears. I knew enough about trust law. I'd been a project engineer for 7 years, not a lawyer, but I'd read that trust document the week after my grandfather died to know that a discretionary management clause did not grant unlimited liquidation authority without beneficiary consent. My grandfather's attorney had explained the protections built into it. What Marcus was describing was not a legal exercise of trustee discretion. It was theft, dressed in the vocabulary of estate planning. How much did you sell it for? I asked. That's not something I need to disclose to you at this stage of administration. It absolutely is, I said. I'm the beneficiary. You have a fiduciary duty to me. Marcus finally looked at me directly, and something cold moved behind his eyes. Rachel, your grandfather left you a very generous inheritance. Don't make this ugly over a machine shop that smelled like motor oil and was staffed by men who never finished high school. Let the attorneys handle the paperwork. Take the cash distribution when it comes, and be grateful. I drove home through Denver in a kind of suspended silence. The kind that happens when your mind is moving too fast for your body to keep up. The shop wasn't just money to me. It was the one place in my life where I had felt completely legitimate, where the work was real, the math was real, the results were measurable to within 1,000th of an inch. My grandfather had wanted me to have it because he knew that. He'd known what it would mean. I called an estate attorney the next morning. The week that followed was one of those strange, quiet periods where you can feel something terrible building just below the surface, like the pressure change before a storm, but you can't quite see it yet. My attorney sent a formal letter to Marcus, requesting a full accounting of the trust assets and the details of the Beckett Precision Parts sale. Marcus's attorney responded with a polite but firm letter explaining that the process was ongoing and that all required disclosures would be made in accordance with the trust's administrative timeline. It was a delay tactic. I knew it. My attorney knew it. But the machinery of law moves slowly, and Marcus had been living inside that machinery his whole life. Then the storm arrived. And it arrived all at once. On a Tuesday morning, I showed up to the engineering firm where I'd worked for 6 years, swiped my badge at the door, and the light turned red. I stood there for a moment, confused, and then security came, not aggressively, almost apologetically, and walked me to HR, where my director was sitting with a woman from legal I'd never seen before. "Rachel," my director said, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable, which told me he was as surprised by this as I was. "We received some documentation over the weekend that's raised some concerns." The folder they slid across the table contained printed emails I had allegedly sent to clients, erratic and unprofessional, complaining about billing irregularities and threatening to share internal rate information if invoices weren't adjusted. There were also 2 internal messages, addressed to a project manager I barely knew, that were paranoid and incoherent in a way that was simply not how I communicated. The grammar was slightly wrong. The tone was slightly wrong. But they had my name on them and my email address in the sender field. "These are fabricated," I said. "We also received a call," the legal woman said carefully, "from a family member. He expressed concern about your mental state following your grandfather's passing. He mentioned you'd been behaving erratically and making accusations against him." "Marcus." "Of course. He said he was sharing this out of concern for you," she continued. "But given the content of these communications and your access to sensitive client data, we have to place you on administrative leave, pending an internal review." I walked out of that building into the flat November light, feeling like the ground had been replaced with something that only looked solid. The next 48 hours unwound with a speed that felt mechanical, like watching dominoes fall in a sequence someone else had arranged. My professional LinkedIn received a comment from an anonymous account accusing me of workplace harassment. The comment was up for 3 hours before LinkedIn removed it, but not before several colleagues had seen it. My cousin Marcus and Diane's daughter, who was 25 and had never worked a day in a field that required a license, posted a vague Instagram story about family members who weaponize grief to extort people. And her followers, who numbered just enough to matter, filled the comments with assumptions. Then my bank called. One of my accounts had been flagged for a suspicious activity review, initiated by a third-party fraud report. My debit card was suspended. My mortgage auto-pay bounced. I sat in my apartment that night with my laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I thought about my grandfather telling me not to let Marcus talk me into anything. I wondered if he had known, really known, what Marcus was capable of. I wondered if "don't let Marcus talk you into selling it" had been less of a casual instruction and more of a warning. I was not going to panic. I was going to work. I had 7 years of engineering discipline behind me, and if there was one thing that training had given me, it was the ability to sit with a problem that felt impossibly large and break it down into components small enough to handle. I pulled up the Colorado Secretary of State's business entity database. I searched for Beckett Precision Parts. The entity had been dissolved. That was expected. But the registered agent on file for the dissolution documents was a name I didn't recognize, not my grandfather's attorney, not Marcus's attorney, not any firm I could identify. I wrote down the name. I searched for the development group Marcus had mentioned. I found a Colorado LLC registered 8 months ago, before my grandfather died. That stopped me cold. I read the filing again. The registration date was 4 months before my grandfather updated his will. Marcus had created the receiving entity before my grandfather even finalized the trust documents. That wasn't opportunism. That was premeditation. I kept pulling threads. The development group had filed a certificate of conversion on Beckett Precision Parts' primary client contracts. What had been a $400,000 business conservatively, given the client list and the specialized equipment, had been transferred for $85,000 in documented consideration. The rest, I could only assume, had moved somewhere else. And then I found the foundation. It was called the Beckett Family Legacy Fund, established as a nonprofit 3 months ago. Its stated purpose was to provide scholarships for trade school students in Colorado. That sounded like my grandfather. It would have sounded like him to anyone who'd known him. The executive director, listed in the IRS determination letter application, was me, Rachel Beckett. My name, my address at the time of my grandfather's death, my professional credentials. I had never heard of this organization. I had signed nothing. I had authorized nothing. I spent 2 more hours tracing the fund's reported activity. It had received $315,000 in donations over 3 months' donations that, based on the donor names I could partially identify through public acknowledgement records, appeared to be shell contributions, cycling through 2 separate LLCs that both traced back to Marcus's real estate network. The scholarships it had supposedly disbursed? I found 3 names in a press release on the fund's barebones website. I searched all 3 names. None of them appeared to exist in any public record. My grandfather's machine shop had not been liquidated for my financial benefit. It had been used as the first piece in a much larger structure, a structure in which Marcus was moving money from distressed real estate deals through a nonprofit that bore the Beckett name, and that nonprofit was being operated, on paper, by me. When the IRS eventually looked at the Beckett Family Legacy Fund, they would not find Marcus. They would find me, Rachel Beckett, the unstable, grieving granddaughter who had apparently been running a fraudulent charity while making paranoid accusations against her family. I understood then what I was dealing with. This wasn't greed. This was architecture. Marcus had not simply stolen my inheritance. He had spent months constructing a structure designed to make me the scapegoat for crimes I hadn't committed, and he had done it so carefully that by the time I realized what was happening, I was already holding the bag. I did not call Marcus. I want to be clear about that. Every instinct I had was screaming to pick up the phone and tell him I knew, to use it as leverage, to demand my grandfather's legacy back. I didn't. I had read enough about how people like Marcus operated to understand that the moment he knew I had this information, he would move faster than me. He would file something, upload something, have his attorney send something that preempted everything I was about to do. I had one advantage. He thought I was broken. He thought I was a grieving, unemployed, financially strangled woman eating through her savings in an apartment, too destabilized to be a real threat. I was going to let him keep thinking that. Instead, I made 2 calls. The first was to my grandfather's original estate attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had drafted the trust documents and who, it turned out, had her own concerns about the administration of the estate that she had not yet had cause to act on. The second call was to the IRS whistleblower office. I had discovered during an audit compliance project 3 years earlier that the IRS pays a percentage of recovered funds to whistleblowers who provide specific, credible information about tax fraud. The Beckett Family Legacy Fund, with its false scholarship recipients and its circular donation structure, was the kind of thing that specific provision had been designed for. Both calls lasted over an hour. Both parties asked me to send documentation. I sent everything I had found, the registration dates, the transfer documents, the dissolution filing, the foundation records, the donor list to 2 encrypted email addresses, and then I drove to a FedEx and sent physical copies to both offices as well, because I was not taking any chances. Then I waited. 3 weeks. I did not post on social media. I did not contact Marcus or Diane. I did not respond to my cousin's Instagram story. I applied for 2 consulting contracts to keep money moving. I ate a lot of sandwiches, and I waited. It was during the 2nd week of waiting that the box arrived. My grandfather's estate had been slow to settle, and the executor, a neutral third party appointed by the court, which had been Patricia's advice from the beginning, had finally gotten around to shipping me the personal effects that had been designated for me in a handwritten codicil. A box arrived at my door containing a framed photo of my grandfather and me at a trade show when I was 17, a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, and an old laptop. A yellow sticky note on the laptop, in Patricia's handwriting, said, "Password is in the letter, check the side pocket of the box." The letter was from my grandfather. He'd written it 6 months before he died, in the careful, slightly formal English of a man who'd grown up writing by hand and never entirely trusted computers. He wrote that he wanted me to have the laptop because he'd kept records on it, records of conversations, records of promises made and broken, records of things he'd noticed about Marcus over the years that he hadn't known what to do with but had felt compelled to document. I am probably being an old fool, he wrote, and maybe none of it amounts to anything, but I know my son, and I know that he has always wanted what other people built, and I want you to have whatever might be useful. The password was his dog's name, and the year the shop opened. My grandfather had not been a sophisticated user of technology, but he had been a meticulous record keeper. He'd been using the laptop's email client for years, and the archive was intact. I spent 2 days reading through it. What I found in that archive made the documents I'd already sent to the IRS look like a rough draft. My grandfather had exchanged emails with Marcus over the course of 2 years in which Marcus had gradually, systematically pressured him to name Marcus as co-trustee, to broaden the discretionary management language in the trust, to allow a third-party management firm, one of Marcus's LLCs, to assist in valuing the business assets. My grandfather had pushed back in every email, and then slowly, incrementally, he had given ground, because Marcus was his son, and because my grandfather, for all his shrewdness, had wanted to believe that family meant something. There was an email thread from 8 months before he died, in which Marcus had laid out, in terms that were almost admirably direct, his plan to liquidate the shop and redirect the proceeds through a non-profit structure. He'd called it estate optimization. My grandfather's response had been 2 sentences. I know what you're doing, Marcus. I'm going to talk to Patricia. Patricia, I later learned, had never received that call. My grandfather had a stroke 4 days after writing that email and spent 2 months recovering. By the time he was well enough to conduct business again, he'd updated his will with more protections, but not enough. Because he hadn't told Patricia about the email, he'd been protecting Marcus, even then. Even knowing, the email thread also contained something I hadn't expected, an exchange between Marcus and a business contact in which Marcus described, in the casual shorthand of men who think they're in private, the entire nonprofit scheme. The fake scholarship recipients, the circular donations, the plan to position me as the fund's executive director so that any investigation would begin and end with me. She's clean, Marcus had written, referring to my professional record. No flags anywhere. Perfect front. My grandfather had forwarded that thread to himself with a single line of subject text. Keep this. He'd known. He hadn't been able to stop it. But he'd kept the record. I forwarded the entire archive to Patricia and to the IRS contact I'd been working with. Then I made one more call to a federal investigator I'd been connected to through Patricia, a woman who specialized in nonprofit fraud and who had been building a case against one of Marcus's real estate LLCs for separate reasons that I didn't need to fully understand. She listened to everything I told her. She asked me to come in the following day. The timing, it turned out, aligned almost perfectly with an event that Marcus and Diane had been planning for 3 months. The formal engagement party for my cousin, their daughter, to be held at the Denver Art Museum's event space on a Saturday evening in December. It was the kind of event that required a venue deposit 8 months in advance. Marcus had bought a new suit. Diane had planned a catered menu. My cousin had been posting about it on every platform she used. I received an invitation, which I thought was either a miscalculation on their part or an act of deliberate cruelty. Either way, I RSVP'd yes. I arrived at the museum 20 minutes before the guests were scheduled to be seated for dinner. I was wearing a black dress and my grandfather's pocket watch on a chain because I wanted something of his with me that night. The event coordinator I'd contacted 2 days earlier, a freelancer who supplemented his museum work with private AV consulting and who had found my offer of double his rate very reasonable, gave me a small nod from across the room when I caught his eye. My cousin saw me first. She was standing near the bar with a cluster of friends, and when she recognized me, her expression went through about 4 changes in under 2 seconds before settling on carefully performed concern. She crossed the room quickly. "Rachel," she said, her voice low. "What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here right now. You're not well." "I've never been better," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant anything in months. "Congratulations on your engagement. He seems lovely." She was still searching for something to say when Marcus materialized at my elbow. He was very good at appearing in rooms. He'd had a lot of practice at it. "Rachel," his voice was quiet, controlled, and precise with warning. "You need to leave. Tonight is not the place for this." "I completely agree," I said. "I don't want any drama at all. I just came to share something with the guests. Something my grandfather would have wanted them to know." The color in Marcus's face shifted by about 2 shades. "If you make a scene, I will have you removed. I'll call the police." "They're already on their way," I said, and I watched his face move through the specific kind of alarm that only registers on people who have genuinely calculated the odds and suddenly find them changed. But not for me. I walked to the small stage at the far end of the room where the toasts were meant to be given later. I picked up the wireless microphone from its stand. About 90 people in the room turned to look at me, which was not the entire guest list, but was enough. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, and my voice came out steady in a way that surprised even me. "My name is Rachel Beckett. Harold Beckett was my grandfather. Many of you knew him. He built Beckett Precision Parts over 41 years, and he left it to me because he believed in what it represented. I'd like to show you what happened to it." The display screens behind me, which had been cycling through photos of my cousin and her fiancé, went dark. Then the emails began. My coordinator had built the presentation exactly as I'd specified. The email from Marcus to his business contact, the one that called me a perfect front. The thread where Marcus had laid out the nonprofit scheme. The registration documents showing the Development LLC had been created before my grandfather's death. The IRS application for the Beckett Family Legacy Fund, with my name as executive director for an organization I'd never heard of. The room was quiet in the way that only happens when a large number of people are all processing the same information at the same time. "That's completely fabricated," Marcus said from somewhere behind me, his voice doing its best to project authority, but I could hear something fraying in it. "It's from your sent folder," I said into the microphone, without turning around. "The metadata timestamps are intact." My grandfather kept a copy. Marcus started toward the stage, and then the front doors of the event space opened. It was not local police. The investigator I'd been working with had made clear that what I'd provided crossed into federal jurisdiction. And the people who came through those doors were dressed and credentialed accordingly. There were 4 of them, and they moved with the kind of calm efficiency that suggested they had done this before in rooms much larger and much louder than this one. Marcus stopped walking toward the stage. "Marcus Ellery?" one of them said. He didn't say it loudly. He didn't need to. My Aunt Diane made a sound that I don't have the right word for. My cousin stood absolutely still near the bar, her champagne glass at a 45-degree angle, her engagement photo still cycling on a secondary screen that my coordinator hadn't gotten to yet. I set the microphone back on its stand and stepped off the stage. Marcus was handcuffed without incident, which I suspect disappointed some part of him that had always imagined himself as the kind of man who would resist dramatically. Diane was asked to accompany the agents for questioning. She walked out in her catering-coordinated silk blouse with the expression of someone who has suddenly discovered that the ground they have been standing on for 20 years is not actually ground. My cousin looked at me from across the room. The guests around her had parted slightly, the way people do around someone who has just become the center of something they don't want to be part of. Her eyes were bright and strange, and she looked younger than 25. "I didn't know everything they were doing," she said. I believe she believed that. I also believe it was not entirely true. "Then I hope you find a good attorney who can help you explain that distinction," I said, "because the IRS is going to ask." I didn't say it with pleasure. I said it because it was the only honest thing to say. The aftermath took 8 months to fully resolve, which is how long federal investigations into tax fraud take when they are going well. The Beckett Family Legacy Fund was dissolved, and its assets, including the recycled proceeds from my grandfather's shop, were frozen and eventually recovered. The Development LLC was audited, and the $315,000 gap between what Beckett Precision Parts was worth and what it had been sold for was attributed to a fraudulent undervaluation scheme that had benefited 2 of Marcus's distressed real estate projects. My inheritance was returned to me with the interest accrued during the dispute period. The estate attorney fees were covered from the seized assets. Marcus pled guilty to wire fraud and breach of fiduciary duty and is currently serving a sentence that his attorney had described to him, before sentencing, as a best-case outcome. Diane cooperated with investigators and received a reduced sentence that her attorney described to her as extraordinarily fortunate. Neither of them has contacted me. My wrongful termination claim against my former employer was settled out of court 4 months after Marcus's arrest, Once it became clear to their legal team that the documentation Marcus had provided to HR had been fabricated using metadata from emails he'd intercepted through a shared family cloud account I hadn't known he had access to. The settlement was quiet and not insignificant. Beckett Precision parts, I discovered during the investigation, had not actually been fully wound down. The client contracts had been transferred, but the equipment lease was still in a limbo state, tied up in the Development LLC's frozen assets. When the liquidation proceedings cleared, I had first right of refusal on acquiring the equipment. I exercised it. The shop reopened 4 months ago, in a smaller space in the same industrial district where my grandfather had built the original. I have 2 machinists, both of whom worked for my grandfather, and who called me when they heard what had happened, because word travels in a community that small. We have 11 active client accounts. The tolerance work is still fine enough that clients ask to come in and watch. My grandfather's framed photo is on the wall above my desk. The pocket watch is in my top drawer. I think about what he said to me on that back porch, that I was the only one who understood what it meant to build something, and I think he was talking about more than the shop. I think he was describing a quality he recognized and was trying to protect, even from himself, even from the part of himself that wanted peace with his son badly enough to make too many concessions. I didn't save his shop for him. I saved it for what he meant when he built it, which is a different thing, and maybe a better one. On the door, the sign reads, Beckett Precision. No family, no legacy, just the name and the work, which is all it ever needed to be. My grandfather used to say that a bad weld will hold until it doesn't, and then it holds nothing. He was talking about metal. He was also, I understand now, talking about everything else. My uncle spent 20 years building a life on bad welds, on the appearance of solidity over the reality of it, and in the end it held exactly as long as those things do. The truth is not elegant or dramatic. It doesn't arrive on schedule, and it doesn't always arrive in time. But it is precise, in the way my grandfather understood precision, down to the last decimal point. And precision, eventually, finds every flaw.